All right, open your Bibles to Genesis 40. Let's go. Fall Retreat 2024. We're here. We are here. Yes. Guys, I love fall retreats. I said this last night. This is my 12th year of fall retreats, and I couldn't be more excited. Where else are you going to watch a man like Caden just down, a happy shake? 1,200 calories in 12 seconds. Let's go. Let's go. I took 2 steps towards that happy shake and I had a gag like reflex happen, which I have a weak stomach, so much of a weak stomach. This week, it was like 3 a.m. I woke up. It was probably, I don't know, like sometime this week, maybe 5 days ago. Woke up at 3 a.m. to myself gagging in bed because I had a dream that I smelt something. I don't think it was a happy shake. But Natalie wakes up. It was Saturday night. That's when it was, Saturday night. She wakes up. She's like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, had a bad dream. But I'm like in bed. So for those of you who are not married, that's what you have to look forward to. Your husband just dry heaving in bed because of dreams. I don't know. It was maybe about changing one of my kids' diapers. That is a hilarious thing. Could you imagine waking up next to someone just, but it's just dry heaving. So anyways, Caden, you're the dog. Right now, Caden is the dog of the 2024. Oh, but hey, let's give it up to Derek for drinking 2 sips of that. My man, Derek. Did you even take 1 sip? There was a lot in there. There was a lot. How many? What's that? He got a chunk. You got a bite of beef. Oh, you were chewing a bite of beef the whole time. Just Dr. Pepper soaked beef. Could you feel the carbonation in the chunk of beef? Man. Hey, who wants to hit up Waterville's McDonald's after this, right? Let's go. All right. Genesis 40. Guys, I love fall retreats. I said this last night. There's a unique opportunity that fall retreats present where we get to come to an amazing camp like this and just open God's word, to spend time in community and see what God does in a unique way where we pull out of kind of the craziness of school, the craziness of work, the craziness of classes, all of that for a weekend and just get time with one another, get time in God's word. So I could not be more excited to see what God shows us through the life of Joseph this weekend. So we're going to pick up kind of where we started or ended last night in Genesis 40. So we closed last night in Genesis 37. In Genesis 38, you've got Joseph sold to Potiphar. So Joseph goes, he gets sold to Potiphar, and he starts working for this captain of the guard, Potiphar. And we see that the Lord was with him and that it's going really well. Everything that Potiphar puts Joseph in charge of, it's flourishing. He's managing everything in his household is going well until Potiphar's wife notices Joseph. And she wants to sleep with him. So she approaches him, says, "Hey, come sleep with me." Joseph refuses. And because of that, Potiphar's wife accuses him of assaulting her. Potiphar is ticked off, has Joseph thrown in prison. And then we get to chapter 40. That's where prison happens. So Joseph is in prison for 2 years. And again, we see that the Lord is with him. So much so that the prison guard puts Joseph in charge of managing the prison. That's how much God is with him. Things are flourishing again. So Joseph is overseeing all the prisoners in the prison. Things are going really well. And then one day, 2 men approach him. They have a dream. Not one that made them throw up, but they have a different dream. And in their dreams, you've got the cupbearer and the baker. A cupbearer is somebody that would literally taste the wine for Pharaoh before he would drink it. He would make sure all of his utensils and things were kept safe so nobody poisoned him. So you got the cupbearer and the baker, former employees of Pharaoh. At one point, Pharaoh got mad at them, throws them in prison. So they're in prison with Joseph, and they have these 2 dreams. So they come, they ask Joseph, "Hey, what do our dreams mean?" Joseph interprets the cupbearers first and tells him "Hey, your dream means that Pharaoh is going to elevate you out of prison. He's going to restore your position, and you're going to be back in good graces with Pharaoh here shortly." The baker hears that, and he's like, "All right, cupbearer got a good interpretation. All right, Joseph, here's my dream. And then Joseph shares with him the bad news. He says, unlike the cupbearer, your dream means that Pharaoh's actually going to execute you. And so a couple months go by. On Pharaoh's birthday, the dreams are fulfilled. He brings the cupbearer and the baker out. He elevates the cupbearer, executes the baker, and then the cupbearer forgets about Joseph. So then we see in chapter 41, 2 years go by. You can see that right in verse 1. At the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. So 2 years, Joseph is in prison, cupbearer's with Pharaoh. Pharaoh has this dream, and it's a dream that's just plaguing him. He can't figure it out. Like, remember from the kids' storybook, 7 fat cows, 7 skinny cows? That's the dream he has. So he brings in his magicians, his counselors. Nobody can tell him the interpretation of the dream. And the cupbearer is standing there hearing like Pharaoh trying to figure out what this dream means. And he's like, hey, when I was in prison, there was a Hebrew slave in there. Me and the baker, we shared with him our dreams. He gave us the correct interpretation. Why don't you see if he can figure out what your dream means? So Pharaoh brings Joseph up out of prison, shares with him his dreams. And Joseph says, hey, I can't give you the interpretation, but my God can. Here's what your dream means. He says the first 7 years, the 7 fat cows, that means there's going to be 7 years of abundance. But then the 7 skinny cows who swallow up the 7 large cows, that means that there's going to be 7 years of famine that follow it. Then Joseph tells Pharaoh, here's what I think you should do. I think you should appoint a wise person who can oversee kind of all the grain collection for those first 7 years to make sure that we're saving enough food for the 7 years of famine. Save enough, and then you'll have plenty in the years of famine, and we'll even be able to feed the world. So Pharaoh's like, that sounds like a great plan, and it sounds like you're the guy to do it. So Joseph goes from being a slave in Potiphar's house, falsely accused, prison for 2 years. Now Pharaoh appoints him as the second in command over all of Egypt. He puts a signet ring on him, says, hey, you're in charge of like everything. So this is like where Joseph is at this point. So then the 7 years of abundance come. Joseph manages all the grain collection really well, really wisely, and those are followed by the 7 years of famine. And we're going to pick up the story 2 years into the famine. The famine is hitting the entire region, including Canaan, where Joseph's brothers and father live. So if you look here in chapter, 42, 43, Let's go 42. That sounds good. Fall retreat, it's casual. All right, so look at chapter 42, verse 1. And what we're going to see tonight is the relational brokenness that happened last night with this broken family. That relational brokenness is restored. Look at verse 1 in chapter 42. When Jacob learned there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you keep looking at each other? Listen, he went on, I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we will live and not die. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he thought something might happen to him. The sons of Israel were among those who came to buy grain, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Joseph was in charge of the country. He sold grain to all its people. His brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan to buy food, they replied. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Joseph remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. You have come to see the weakness of the land. So Joseph's brothers, they come down to Egypt to buy grain. Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him. Like, remember, you've got a couple years with Potiphar, 2 years in prison, 7 years of abundance. We're 2 years into the famine. Like, this is a decade and a half later than what we looked at last night. So his brothers don't recognize him. He was speaking to them through a translator. He's wearing like his official Egyptian attire. So he goes on to start asking them questions about the family. And he learns that his mother Rachel had another son, Benjamin, that eventually Rachel passed away. But instead of selling grain to his brother, he creates this situation for them. Look down at verse 14. Then Joseph said to them, I have spoken. You are spies. This is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one from among you to get your brother. The rest of you will be imprisoned so that your words can be tested to see if they are true. If not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." So Joseph imprisoned them together for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, "I fear God. Do this and you will live. If you are honest, let one of you be confined to the guardhouse while the rest of you go and take grain to relieve the hunger of your households. Bring your youngest brother to me so that your words can be confirmed. Then you won't die." And they consented to this. So Joseph imprisons his brother Simeon, sends the grain back with his brothers. They leave. They head back to Canaan where Jacob is. So they get back. They tell Jacob, and Jacob's upset. He's like, "Why'd you tell this master of Egypt that you have a younger brother? Like, why'd you do this to me?" And Jacob refuses to send Benjamin with him. So eventually, though, they're able to convince Jacob to send Benjamin. They're like, "Hey, he won't give us back Simeon unless we send Benjamin. We can't buy grain there unless we go back and show him Benjamin." So eventually they convinced Jacob to send Benjamin with them. And here's how they convinced him ultimately. Look at chapter 43, verse 8. Then Judah said to his father Israel, remember, Jacob has two names, Israel and Jacob. So verse 8, then Judah said to his father Israel, "Send the boy with me. We will be on our way so that we may live and not die, neither we nor you nor our dependents." They had run out of food at this point. They needed more food. They couldn't get it unless they got Benjamin. Verse 9, "I will be responsible for him. You can hold me personally accountable if I do not bring him back to you and set him before you. I will be guilty before you forever. If we had not delayed, we could have come back twice by now." So Judah says this. They go back with their brother Benjamin. Judah presents this hey, I'll take personal accountability over Benjamin's life. Jacob agrees. So they arrive back to Egypt. Joseph invites them into his house, and he actually hosts a feast for them. He reunites them with Simeon. He's like, "Hey, bring Simeon out." He reunites the brothers, and they're having this incredible feast. Look all the way at verse 26 and 43. When Joseph came home, they brought him the gift they had carried into the house, and they bowed to the ground before him. He asked if they were well, and he said, "How is your elderly father that you told me about? Is he still alive?" They answered, "Your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive." And they knelt low and paid homage to him. When he looked up and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, he asked, "Is this your youngest brother that you told me about?" Then he said, "May God be gracious to you, my son." Joseph hurried out because he was overcome with emotion for his brother, and he was about to weep. He went into an inner room and wept there. Then he washed his face and came out, regaining his composure. He said, "Serve the meal." They served him by himself, his brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who were eating with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, since that is detestable to them. They were seated before him in order by age, from the firstborn to the youngest. The men looked at each other in astonishment. Portions were served to them from Joseph's table, and Benjamin's portion was 5 times larger than any of theirs. They drank and became drunk with Joseph. So, brother reunion right here. They're having a party. Joseph meets Benjamin. He reunites the brothers. He hosts this big feast. He's overcome with emotion, leaves, but they're having this big feast. But then Joseph creates a final test for them. Look at verses 1 and 2 of 44. So the feast ends the next day. Joseph commanded his steward, "Fill the men's bags with as much food as they can carry, and put each one's silver at the top of his bag. Put my cup, the silver one, at the top of the youngest one's bag, along with the silver for his grain." So he did as Joseph told him. So the servants do this, what they're doing, they came to purchase grain, and Joseph's put their silver back in their bags, and then take my silver cup, put it in Benjamin's bag. So the servants do that. They all say goodbye. The brothers, they take off, but then the Egyptians, they let them get down the road a little bit, and then they take off after them. The Egyptians catch up, And they say, hey, one of you stole from us. And the brothers are like pleading with them. They're like, no, like none of us stole from you. Like last night, remember the party? Like none of us stole from you. And then the brothers say, you can check all of our bags. If you find your master's stolen cup in any of our bags, you can kill that person. So the Egyptians are like, okay. And one by one, they open the top of each bag. And each brother is shocked because their silver is sitting right there on top of their bag. And then they get to Benjamin's bag, open it up, and there's the cup. And they're freaking out. They're like, oh my word. So they all ride back to meet with Joseph. Look at verse 30. So they're freaking out. They ride back. They don't want Benjamin to die. Verse 30. This is Judah talking to Joseph. He says, if I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, his life is wrapped up with the boy's life. When he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. Then your servants will have brought the gray hairs of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in sorrow. Your servant became accountable to my father for the boy, saying, if I do not return him to you, I will always bear the guilt for sinning against you, my father. Now please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. Let him go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father without the boy? I could not bear to see the grief that would overwhelm my father. So they get back. Joseph says, hey, I'm not going to kill Benjamin. He's just going to stay in Egypt with me as his slave. But look what Judah says. Right? Judah's like, hey, I made this agreement with my dad. I became personally accountable for him. Take me. Let Benjamin go back. Let me remain as your slave for the rest of my life. At this, Joseph can't bear it. Look at the beginning of chapter 45, verse 1. Joseph could no longer keep his composure in front of all of his attendants. So he called out, send everyone away from me. No one was with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it. And also Pharaoh's household heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But they could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. So the brothers, they're terrified. They're realizing this is Joseph, the one we threw in a pit, the one that we sold into slavery. This is Joseph. He's been testing us, all these things. But then look how Joseph reassures them. Verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come near me. And they came near. I am Joseph, your brother, he said, the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. This is incredible. Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers. And instead of anger and hatred, what does he say? He says, God sent me here. God had a plan in all of this. We would have expected him to be angry at him, to seek revenge, but instead Joseph showed grace. Here's Joseph, the second most powerful man in the world. Egypt is the world dominating country at this point. He's the second most powerful man in the world, and he doesn't exact revenge. Instead, he shows grace. He forgives his brothers. He has this mind-blowing perspective, right? It wasn't you who sent me here. It was God. So at this point, Joseph sends his brothers back to the land of Canaan to bring their whole family to Egypt so that they can settle in the land of Egypt, so that they can be fed during the famine. And it's just this powerful story of forgiveness. Here's Joseph, who was stripped by his brothers, left for dead in a pit, sold as a slave, and instead of seeking revenge, instead of paying them back, he forgives them. He shows them grace. right? And it's like, how could Joseph forgive such a terrible sin? Like we said this last night, like the thing that his brothers did to him, it's up there in the worst of the worst things that another human could do to a human. Your brothers intend to murder you, throw you in a pit, then sell you as a slave. And because of that, now you've been falsely accused by Potiphar. You spent 2 years in prison. And here's Joseph. Instead of being like obsessed with bitterness and revenge, Joseph is gracious and offers them forgiveness. How is that possible? How is it possible to have that level of relational restoration? In light of that, like deep relational brokenness, how can we have this kind of restoration in our relationships? Well, I want to look at the story and I want to show you 4 things that we learn about forgiveness from this story. 4 aspects that will help us embrace forgiveness and graciousness. So here's the 4 lessons we're going to work through from this story. The first is we're going to see the prerequisite of forgiveness. Then we're going to see the cost of forgiveness. Third, we'll see the offer of forgiveness. And then last, we'll see the challenge. So what is the prerequisite of forgiveness? What is the cost of forgiveness? What's the offer? And what is the challenge? So first, what is the prerequisite for forgiveness? Well, really, if you're going to be someone who forgives, you have to have, something has to be true about you before you even enter conflict. Like, what was true of Joseph? Well, what did we see in verse 8? Look back at verse 8. What does he say? He says, therefore it was not you who sent me, but God. What's the prerequisite? It's having an unshakable confidence in God's sovereignty. It's looking at life with an eternal perspective. Like Joseph had the wherewithal to look at his brothers and say, that, what you guys did to me, that was the hand of God. You were tools in his sovereign plan. That's an astounding perspective that Joseph has, an eternal perspective, but it's crucial. You and I will be plagued with bitterness until we make this perspective shift. Until we see that everything that we experience in life is within the sovereign plan of God. That our default mindset, like when somebody hurts us, it's like, oh, you did something to me. Our first thought should be, I wonder how God is going to work through this. That's the mindset that Joseph had. Knowing that no one can do anything to you that could possibly be outside the control and sovereignty of God. And this doesn't mean that our hurts and pains aren't real, but what it means is having a 50,000-foot view of our life. To know everything that occurs in my life fits into God's plan for me. It has a purpose. So why could Joseph forgive? Well, first, he had an unshakable confidence in God's sovereignty, an eternal perspective. Here's the second thing that this story shows us. It shows us the cost of forgiveness. This story shows us that forgiveness is not free, that there's always a cost to forgiveness. Think back to the story. Ask yourself, what did it cost Joseph to forgive his brothers? Well, it cost him everything. In some ways, it cost him his life. It cost him being with his mother before she died. It cost him meeting his younger brother. It cost him a prison sentence. It cost him being falsely accused. Here's the reality. The only way Joseph could have forgiven is if he absorbed the cost of forgiveness. If he was willing to swallow the cost himself. So if you steal $5 from me, I'm pointing at you, Juan. I don't know. I looked at you when I said that. If you steal $5 from me, how can we be reconciled? Well, there's one of 2 ways. Either I say, pay up, give me $5. Or I say, hey, you know what? No big deal. I forgive you. But if you don't give me $5, where's the cost of that forgiveness? It's on me. I absorb the cost. There is always a cost to reconciliation. For us to be reconciled, it'll either cost you $5 or it'll cost me $5. But forgiveness isn't free. For Joseph, there were only 2 ways Joseph could be reconciled to his brothers. One way would have been to say, hey, you have a debt against me. For the same amount of time that you made me a slave, I'm going to enslave you. I'm going to make you bear the cost of our reconciliation. But why didn't Joseph do that? Because that would have been revenge, not reconciliation. Instead, he said, you offended me. You sinned against me. But instead of making you pay the cost of forgiveness, I'll absorb it. I'll absorb the cost of reconciliation. And that's what he did. You see, his forgiveness wasn't just ignoring sin, right? He said it right there in 45. He's like, you sold me into slavery. He's not ignoring sin, but he absorbed the cost. He consciously bore the cost of forgiveness himself. This is what forgiveness costs. When someone sins against you, there is a debt. Maybe it's a hit to your reputation. Maybe it's an inconvenience. Maybe it's the cost of you being falsely accused. Maybe it's the cost of emotional hardship. Maybe it's the cost of physical pain. There is a cost when we experience conflict. And the question is, are you willing to absorb the cost for forgiveness? Now, this doesn't mean that you're a doormat who people just walk over. It doesn't mean that there aren't consequences for the offender. But it does mean if you're going to experience freedom from bitterness and hatred, you will have to make the decision to absorb the cost of conflict. Now, you might be thinking like, that sounds terrible. Like, what are you talking about? Like the victim has to absorb the cost? Like, where's the justice in that? How is that? How is it that I have to absorb the cost of reconciliation? How could I be willing to do that? Well, here's the first thing. There's no alternative. Like really, there isn't. If you are going to consistently forgive, you have to decide to bear the cost of forgiveness. Otherwise, the only alternative is revenge and bitterness. You can't ignore the fact that you have to absorb the cost of forgiveness if you are going to have reconciliation inside your relationships. You have to accept that showing grace will come at your expense. So how can you do that? Like, how could any of us be willing to accept those terms of forgiveness? Well, the only way you will be willing to bear the cost of forgiveness is if you realize that the cost of your forgiveness was absorbed by someone else. Who was that? Well, we actually get a hint back in 44, right? The Egyptians are catching the brothers. They're opening the bags. They see the silver. Benjamin is caught with the cup. And what happens? There was an exchange that took place. Judah comes forward and he says, take me, not Benjamin. Judah says, make me the slave. Don't enslave Benjamin. There's an exchange that happens. Judah intervenes. And this exchange is the same exchange that we experienced. When the Lion of Judah saw us caught red-handed with silver cups in our bags. When we had a debt against a holy God. And the Lion of Judah said, let there be an exchange. Let me be in their place. Take me over them. Let the penalty of sin fall squarely on me. The Lion of Judah said, let me be treated as a rebel, as someone who's rejected God. Let me absorb the full cost of their forgiveness. You see, when Jesus was taken from the garden, abandoned by his friends, falsely accused, spit on and beaten, he was taking our place. He was absorbing the cost of our forgiveness. When his back was beat with whips, when he was forced to carry a cross, when his hands and feet were pierced, when he was stripped and naked and crucified between two criminals, he was making an exchange. In the physical torment of that moment when Jesus was on the cross, it paled in comparison to the spiritual torment that Jesus faced. When the full wrath of God was put on him. The full weight of God's justice placed on Jesus for every sin that humanity had ever committed. I mean, think about the weight of that. Every sinful action, all of humanity, every sinful thought, all of it, the penalty of all of it was placed on Jesus on the cross. You see, the Lion of Judah absorbed the cost of our forgiveness, and the justice of God was satisfied. which means the cost of forgiveness for every sin was paid in full 2,000 years ago on the cross. Here's the offer of grace. Jesus, the Lion of Judah, absorbed the cost of forgiveness for you. God was 0% responsible for our relational brokenness with him, and yet absorbed 100% of the penalty. Until you realize that, you will never be able to extend grace. Until you are overwhelmed by the costly grace of Jesus, that he paid for your sin in full, you will always be someone that keeps accounts, that hangs on to receipts. But when you realize the costly grace that saved you, you will become the sort of person who can forgive and are willing to bear the cost of forgiveness. Now, why would we want this? Like some of you are like, honestly, I don't know why what's the big deal about forgiveness? This doesn't sound that great. Like I have to absorb the cost of forgiveness. Like why should we want to be people who forgive? Well, think back to Joseph. Here's the third lesson that we see. It's the offer of forgiveness. Think back to Joseph. What was at stake for him if he didn't forgive? Here's what's at stake. He knew that his brothers could have made him a slave twice. The first time was when they sold him to the Ishmaelites. But he could have been made a slave twice to the bitterness that he would have felt towards them. You see, as long as you are unwilling to forgive, you are a slave to that person. You are a slave to bitterness, and that bitterness will eat you from the inside out. Like we know 70-year-olds like this, like a cantankerous old man who just for decades has lived with bitterness. And we see like how miserable they are. If you hang on to bitterness and are not willing to forgive, that's your future. You will experience a living hell. There is a cost to forgive, but that cost pales in comparison to what it will cost you to be bitter. Hanging on to bitterness in the long run will actually cost you more than whatever it would have cost you to forgive that person. Bitterness will eat you alive. And if you allow it, it will make you a slave a second time. There's a pastor, Tim Keller, and he tells this story about this teenage girl who was hurt by her father. And he's counseling with her, and at one point, he said to her, if you don't forgive your father, he will always control your life. And he goes on, he says, you see, there will be things you do because you know he would have hated them. And then there will be things that you don't do because you know that he would have approved. But you won't make decisions or operate in your life free from your dad. If you don't forgive him, he will continue to rule you, control you, and he won't just have hurt you in the past, but he will continue to hurt you for the rest of your life. See, Joseph could have been enslaved twice. And for some of you right now, you are a slave to bitterness. And bitterness is deceiving you. It's whispering to you like, hey, doesn't it feel good to hate this person? Doesn't it feel good to blame all your problems on them? Doesn't it feel good to be upset at them? But what you don't realize is that you are trapped in a cycle of pain and hurt. And it is actually bitterness that is keeping you from experiencing healing. You see, as long as you refuse to forgive, you will be a slave to that offense. That's what's at stake. That's why we have to forgive. But what is forgiveness offering you? It's offering you freedom. It's offering you joy. A life of freedom and joy. A life that has an eternal perspective, knowing God can use anything in my life for his purposes. And a life that's free from the pains and hurts, for being enslaved to the pains and hurts that have been against you. Freedom instead of being made a slave over and over again. That's the restoring grace of Jesus. This is why it's worth it to forgive. If we're going to forgive, we have to have an eternal perspective. We have to be willing to absorb the cost. And we have to know that it's offering us freedom and joy. Now, you might still be wrestling with this. You're like, all right, eternal perspective, cost, I get it, freedom and joy. But forgiveness is still really hard. Like, I don't know if I can forgive. It feels unfair. Or maybe you're sitting there like, yeah, Stephen, you don't know what's been done to me. How can we become people who forgive? Well, you're not alone in struggling with this. In fact, Jesus' own disciples struggled with the concept of forgiveness. And in Matthew 18, Peter comes up to Jesus. He's like, hey, Jesus, how many times should I forgive someone who offends me? And the way Jesus answers that is with a story. And this story presents us the challenge of forgiveness. So the story is in Matthew 18, starting in verse 23. I'm actually going to read it for you. Here's the story that Jesus tells to answer, how many times must I forgive? So Jesus says this, for this reason, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle accounts, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought before him. Since he did not have enough money to pay it back, his master commanded that he, his wife, his children, and everything he had be sold to pay the debt. At this, the servant fell down, face down before him, and said, be patient with me, and I will pay you everything. Then the master of that servant had compassion, released him, and forgave him the loan. That servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him, started choking him, and said, pay what you owe. At this, his fellow servant fell down and began begging him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back to you. But he wasn't willing. Instead, he went and threw him into prison until he could pay what was owed. When the other servants saw what had taken place, they were deeply distressed and went and reported to their master everything that had happened. Then, after he summoned him, his master said, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you also have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? And because he was angry, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay everything that was owed. So also my heavenly Father will do to you unless every one of you forgives his brother or sister from your heart. All right, what's going on in this story? You've got a master, you've got a servant who owes an insurmountable debt to him. The master calls the loan. The man runs in. He says, I can't pay it. The master's like, okay, well, I'm going to sell you, your wife, your child, everything you own. And the guy's like, no, have mercy. The master gives him mercy. And then that servant goes out, finds a guy that owes him a very little amount, and it does not extend mercy to him. What's Jesus showing us in this story? Well, think about who the characters are. The master is God. We are the servant who experienced grace. People who offend us are our fellow servants. What is happening in this story? Jesus is showing us that when we are unwilling to forgive, we are like the ungracious servant. And this is the challenge of forgiveness. The challenge is to recognize that though our hurts and pains are real, the offenses committed against us pale in comparison to the offense that we have committed against a holy God. That we are people who have been forgiven an insurmountable debt. And as people who have been forgiven an insurmountable debt, we should extend mercy to those who hurt us. That's the challenge of forgiveness. It's to remember that Jesus was the ultimate suffering servant, as Isaiah calls him. That was Jesus who was sold for 30 pieces to go to the cross to offer us grace. To remember that he was the Lion of Judah who took our place through the great exchange on the cross. To remember that we have been forgiven an insurmountable debt. And that though the offenses against us are real, they pale in comparison to our offense that has been forgiven by a holy God through Jesus. We must forgive. If you don't, you will be plagued to a life of bitterness. It will consume you and it will create a living hell. Forgiveness is offering you a life of freedom and joy as people who know we've experienced the grace of God and turn around and extend that same grace to others. Joseph and his brothers, their relationship was restored. It displays the great grace and power that God has to restore the relationships that we experience brokenness in. Let's pray. God, what an incredible story. A story of intense brokenness between brothers, but an amazing display of grace and forgiveness from Joseph, who looked at his brothers and instead of exacting revenge, instead of getting even, instead of being enslaved by bitterness, he had a perspective that you were at work in ways that he couldn't see. He was willing to absorb the cost of forgiveness. And God, you healed their relationship through your power and your grace. God, would we have the same mindset as Joseph and when we experience relational conflict? Would we be people who would say, man, I have been forgiven by God, a God who I had offended, and yet he showed me grace. And now I can turn and extend the same grace to others. Lord, would that be true of us? And would we experience the freedom and joy that forgiveness offers us? Amen.